You're about to hear one of the most intriguing stories from the Bible. Abraham's life is full of surprises, challenges, and above all, a promise that seemed impossible to fulfill. How did a man who left his homeland without knowing where he was going, faced enemies, struggled with doubts, and was called to make an unimaginable sacrifice? What motivated Abraham to follow such an uncertain path? And how did this decision change the fate of millions? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Stay until the end, because we will share a powerful prayer together, connecting with the same God who guided every step of Abraham's journey. Abram was born in Ur of the Chaldeans, an ancient and prosperous city located in Mesopotamia, known for its commerce and as a major religious center. Abram's original name means exalted father, reflecting expectations for his life from the beginning. His father, Terah, was an influential man in the community and had two other sons, Nahor and Haran. Haran, the youngest brother, died in Ur, leaving a son named Lot, who would later play a key role in Abram's journey. The family lived in a society marked by polytheism, where many gods were worshipped, but Ur was especially devoted to the moon god, Nana. Ur was rich in culture and history. Its streets were bustling with merchants, artisans, and priests, and temples dominated the landscape. However, despite this wealth, Terah's family faced their own tragedies. Haran's death deeply affected everyone, especially Lot, who was treated almost like a son by his uncle Abram. After this event, Terah decided it was time to leave Ur behind. The journey from Ur to Haran wasn't easy. Abram, along with his father Terah, his wife Sarai, and his nephew Lot, set out northward. The journey was arduous, passing through deserts and barren lands, following one of the trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to the northern regions. Along the way, the family faced harsh conditions, but they stayed united. As the eldest son, Abram took on much of the responsibility, helping organize resources and ensuring everyone's safety. Young Lot looked up to his uncle, admiring his leadership and care throughout the journey. Haran, their final destination, was an important trading hub, located at a strategic crossroads of trade routes. There, the family settled and began a new life. The city had similarities to Ur, but it was different enough to provide a fresh start for Terah and his family. Abram prospered in his activities, and Sarai, his wife, accompanied him in all his responsibilities. During the years in Haran, Abram and Sarai remained childless, a difficult situation for the time, as large families were expected. Despite this, the couple remained united. Sarai, whose beauty was admired by all, faced the pain of infertility in silence. Abram, in turn, dedicated himself to his work and to caring for his family, including young Lot, who had become like a son to him. Life in Haran stabilized, and it seemed that this would be their final home, but this peace would last only for a while. Terah's death in Haran marked a new turning point for the family. Terah, who had led his family in search of a new home after leaving Ur, was now buried in Haran. As the eldest son, Abram took on the responsibility of leading the clan. He and Sarai maintained their home in Haran, while Lot grew increasingly independent. Haran, with its bustling commercial activity, continued to offer opportunities, but Terah's death brought an emotional weight that added to Abram's lingering memories of his homeland. Up until this point, Abram's life had been marked by significant changes, moving from Ur to Haran, from son to leader, from a comfortable life to an unpredictable journey. His relationships with his family, especially Sarai and Lot, grew stronger. He was the pillar on which everyone relied, and his determination to secure a future for all was evident in every decision he made. However, despite his prosperity in Haran, something seemed to be missing, as if Abram's journey was far from complete. Now, with Terah's death, Abram knew that things might change once again. Haran was just another stage in his life, and just as he had followed his father to this point, something inside him indicated that his journey wasn't over. Abram's destiny was about to be redirected, though it wasn't yet clear what awaited him. After Terah's death, while Abram continued his life in Haran, something extraordinary happened. Amidst the routine of his days, he heard the voice of God, clear and commanding. "Abram," the Lord called. Abram stopped and looked around, unsure where the voice was coming from. "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." These words, filled with authority, echoed within Abram. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." Abram listened in reverence, his heart racing. "But Lord," Abram replied, "how can this be? I have no children, and my wife Sarai is barren. How can I become a great nation?" God's voice continued, firm and full of promise. "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Abram fell silent, reflecting on the magnitude of the words he had just heard. The promise was too great for him to fully grasp at the moment, but he felt compelled to trust. This voice was unlike anything he had ever heard before. The decision to obey wasn't easy. Abram was 75 years old, already well established in Haran, surrounded by his possessions, servants, and all that he had built over the years. But God's call was clear, and the promise of a great nation was something he could not ignore. So, Abram looked at Sarai, his wife, and at Lot, his nephew, and announced their departure. "We are leaving Haran," he said firmly. "Where are we going?" asked Sarai, familiar with Abram's bold decisions. "I don't know yet," he replied, "but the Lord will guide us." And so, Abram, Sarai, and Lot, along with their servants and herds, began the long journey to an unknown land. Every step they took was an act of faith. They didn't have a map or a clear destination, only the confidence in the words God had spoken. The desert ahead seemed relentless, but Abram kept his eyes on the future. As the sun beat down on them, God's promise remained a shadow of hope, shielding them from doubts that might arise along the way. During the journey, many nights were spent around campfires, where Abram reflected on God's words. "Is it possible?" he asked himself quietly. "Me, the father of a great nation? And Sarai? How will she bear a child?" But God's voice never left his mind. It was a covenant that had been made, and though the details were still unclear, Abram was determined to trust in the divine plan. Each new morning, as the group resumed their trek, Abram's faith was renewed. They finally arrived in Canaan after many days of travel, exhausted but with hearts full of expectation. The land before them was inhabited by other peoples, but as he set foot on that soil for the first time, Abram felt something different. It was as if the very ground whispered God's promise. "This will be the home of your descendants," he heard again in his spirit. Abram looked to the heavens and, with deep gratitude, built an altar to the Lord, marking this moment as a covenant between him and God. The land of Canaan would one day be the inheritance of his children. While Abram was building the altar, God appeared again, reaffirming the promise, "To your offspring I will give this land." Abram's heart filled with hope. He knew that this covenant was real, and even though he didn't fully understand how the promises would be fulfilled, he was certain that the future was in God's hands. The land of Canaan, though not yet his possession, was the setting for something great to come. Every stone of the altar represented his trust in the divine promise. Sarai watched closely, trying to understand what the future held. She knew the promises involved an heir, but so far there were no signs of pregnancy. Still, Abram's strength gave her hope. He who had led his family through so many adversities now trusted in something that seemed impossible. For Abram, each new day in Canaan was a step closer to the fulfillment of the legacy God had promised, a great nation born of his faith and obedience. Now that they were in Canaan, God's promise was starting to take shape. Abram, who had left everything behind in Haran, felt that the divine plan was only beginning to unfold. The promised land was before his eyes, but the full realization was yet to come. God had made a covenant with him, and that covenant would grow stronger over time. The next step would be to continue building this relationship with God while patiently waiting for the next promise to be fulfilled. When Abram and his group finally arrived in the land of Canaan, the landscape before them was vast and varied. Mountains, valleys, and plains stretched as far as the eye could see. Some parts were fertile, while others were arid and harsh. Abram looked around, contemplating the place where he believed God had led him. However, this land was already inhabited by various peoples, such as the Canaanites, and this presented a new challenge for Abram. How could this already occupied land become the home of his descendants, as God had promised? The answer came soon enough. In a unique and revealing encounter, God appeared to Abram again, reaffirming his promise, "To your offspring I will give this land." These words echoed as a profound reassurance in Abram's heart. He knew that despite the visible obstacles, God's promise was unquestionable. The divine presence in that moment was palpable, filling Abram with an even greater conviction that the land of Canaan would one day belong to his lineage. This promise was the foundation of the faith that had driven him since his departure from Haran. In response to God's presence and promise, Abram built an altar. It was a symbolic gesture, a spiritual marker, expressing his gratitude and devotion. The altar served as a visible reminder that this land, though still occupied, belonged to God, and by his word would be given to Abram's descendants. As Abram constructed the altar, he reflected on the greatness of the promise. This was not just any land, it was sacred ground where future generations would live, where a nation would be established under God's command and blessing. Every time Abram moved within Canaan, he built altars to God. One was erected in Shechem, near the great tree of Moreh, a place already revered by the local inhabitants. Abram's presence there wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. He knew that, although his journey had only begun, God had already determined the fate of the entire land. With each new altar, Abram reaffirmed his commitment to the covenant and his trust in the promise God had made to him. It was a visible demonstration of faith in the midst of uncertainty. Life in Canaan, however, wasn't without challenges. Abram and his family had to adapt to a land where other peoples were already established. Conflicts could arise, and the daily needs of his growing household had to be met. But Abram, strengthened by God's promise, moved forward with confidence. He knew that regardless of the difficulties, the covenant with God was firm and unshakable. The land they walked on didn't belong to the Canaanite inhabitants, but to the God who had led Abram there, and this fact sustained him. Abram also realized that God's promise wasn't just about a physical territory. There was something much deeper. The land of Canaan represented the future of his lineage, the fulfillment of a covenant that would transcend generations. Every time he looked at the hills and valleys before him, he saw not just pastures for his flocks, but a legacy being built. It was faith in action, where obedience to the divine call would bear fruit that he might never fully see, but that he was certain would come to pass. Sarai watched beside Abram, sharing in the same hopes and expectations. She knew that the promises involved more than just land. There had to be an heir for everything to be fulfilled. However, until then, there were still no signs of pregnancy. Even so, Sarai's faith remained strong. She believed, just as Abram did, that the God who promised the land would also provide the heir. Together, they trusted in the covenant God had made and waited patiently for the next step in his plan. The time in Canaan began to present challenges for Abram and his group. A severe famine struck the land, making it difficult to sustain the herds and provide food for his family and servants. The drought affected the fields, and what had once seemed like a promising place now turned into a barren and lifeless terrain. Faced with this adversity, Abram made a bold and risky decision to go down to Egypt, a land known for its abundance of food, especially during times of crisis. He knew the journey would be long and full of uncertainties, but there was no other choice. As they approached Egypt, a new fear gripped Abram. He knew that Sarai, his wife, was exceedingly beautiful, and feared that upon their arrival in Egypt, the men there would desire her. Abram was afraid that the Egyptians would kill him to take Sarai for themselves. In an effort to protect his life, he asked Sarai to pretend to be his sister. "Say you are my sister," Abram asked her, "so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared." Sarai, aware of the risks, agreed to follow the plan, knowing that their survival depended on it. As soon as they arrived in Egypt, as Abram had feared, the Egyptians noticed Sarai's beauty. She was taken into Pharaoh's palace, and Pharaoh, captivated by her appearance, decided to take her into his harem. Because of Sarai, Pharaoh treated Abram very well, giving him cattle, servants, and wealth. Abram seemed to have succeeded in his plan, but there was a heavy price to pay for this deception. He knew that his decision was far from ideal, but in trying to protect his life, he had compromised both his wife's integrity and his own faith. Time passed, and Sarai remained in Pharaoh's palace, far from Abram. During this period, God intervened decisively. Great plagues began to strike Pharaoh's household and his officials, and soon Pharaoh realized that something was wrong. Upon investigating the cause of these misfortunes, Pharaoh discovered that Sarai, the woman he had taken as his own, was actually Abram's wife, not his sister, as he had been led to believe. Furious at the betrayal, Pharaoh summoned Abram to confront him. "Why did you say she was your sister?" Pharaoh asked, his voice filled with indignation. "I might have taken her as my wife." Despite the severity of the situation, Pharaoh chose not to punish Abram harshly. Instead, he ordered Abram, Sarai, and all their possessions to leave Egypt immediately. Though humiliated by having been found out, Abram recognized that God had protected his wife and spared him from worse consequences. God's grace had been evident, even in the midst of Abram's flawed strategy. Abram's departure from Egypt was marked by a mixture of relief and reflection. He returned to Canaan richer than when he had left, with more servants and livestock. But the cost of his prosperity had been the integrity of his faith and his relationship with Sarai. They knew that God had been merciful in protecting them, but they also learned a valuable lesson about trust and truth. God had made a promise to Abram, and he needed to learn to trust fully in this covenant without resorting to deception. Sarai, for her part, had also been deeply affected by the entire experience. She knew that her husband had acted out of fear, but that didn't make the episode any less painful. Yet, like Abram, she understood that God had been faithful to the covenant, protecting her even in the midst of danger. Back in Canaan, the couple realized that they needed to align even more closely with God's plans and trust completely in the God who had led them this far. After returning from Egypt, Abram and Lot both prospered greatly. Their herds grew so large that the land of Canaan, where they lived, could no longer support both of them. Disputes began to break out between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen. The land could not sustain them both, and these conflicts threatened the peace between them. Abram, a man of great wisdom and a peaceful spirit, realized that a decision had to be made before tensions escalated further. He knew that the solution didn't lie in prolonging the arguments, but in peacefully separating from his nephew. Calmly, Abram approached Lot and proposed a solution that demonstrated both his generosity and the humility of his heart. "Let there be no strife between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers," Abram said softly. "Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Although he was older and held more authority, Abram allowed Lot to choose first, showing his trust in God and his willingness to preserve peace. Lot, upon hearing Abram's offer, looked around and began to assess the land. His eyes turned toward the fertile plains of the Jordan, where the river flowed abundantly, and the land seemed ideal for his herds. It was a land that at first glance offered prosperity and ease. Without hesitation, Lot chose the Jordan plain, which extended toward the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The decision seemed wise. After all, who wouldn't choose the more fertile land? However, Lot was unaware that the cities in that region were known for their extreme wickedness, something that would have grave consequences later. Abram, on the other hand, accepted Lot's choice with serenity. He knew that God was with him, and that the divine promise didn't depend on the quality of the land he inhabited. After the separation, Abram continued his journey into the land of Canaan, while Lot settled near Sodom. Though the separation was difficult, it was an important milestone in Abram's journey. He understood that sometimes one must let go of something to allow God's promise and peace to prevail. His faith was not in circumstances, but in the covenant God had made with him. After Lot's departure, God appeared to Abram once again, reaffirming his promise. "Lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever." God's words echoed as a confirmation that, though Lot had chosen the more fertile land, Abram held God's blessing, and the covenant remained unshaken. Abram was destined to become the father of a great nation, regardless of appearances or the choices others made. Abram's response to God's promise was once again to build an altar. This time in Hebron, he established a place of worship, symbolizing his ongoing trust in God. The altar was more than a simple act of devotion. It was a symbol of the covenant between God and Abram, a public declaration that he would continue to walk by faith, regardless of the circumstances. While Lot sought the fertility of the plains, Abram chose faithfulness to God, knowing that true prosperity would come from the divine covenant. As the years passed in Canaan, Abram continued to wait for the fulfillment of God's promise of numerous descendants. Despite his unshakable faith, the wait became increasingly challenging. Then God appeared to Abram again, bringing words that would transform his life and reaffirm the covenant between them. "I am God Almighty," said the Lord with authority. "Walk before me and be blameless." These words marked the beginning of a new chapter in Abram's story, where an even deeper covenant would be established between him and God. God made an extraordinary promise to Abram, stating that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. "Look now toward the heavens and count the stars if you are able to count them," said God. "So shall your descendants be." Abram, now advanced in age, heard these words with a renewed faith. Despite the challenging circumstances, he believed that God would fulfill his promise. As a sign of this new phase, God changed Abram's name, which meant exalted father, to Abraham, meaning father of a multitude, confirming the grand destiny that awaited him. In addition to renaming Abram, God also changed Sarai's name to Sarah, meaning princess. Though she was old, Sarah would be the mother of kings and a great nation. The covenant between God and Abraham was formalized through a covenant of blood. "This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised," said God. Circumcision, to be performed on the 8th day of a boy's life, would be the physical and perpetual sign of the covenant between God and Abraham's descendants. Abraham, obedient to the divine command, was the first to be circumcised, followed by all the men in his household. This moment was deeply solemn, as it symbolized the physical signing of an eternal spiritual covenant. Circumcision wasn't just a ritual, it was a tangible mark of the covenant that bound God and Abraham forever. Each male descendant of Abraham would bear the sign of the covenant, ensuring that future generations would never forget the promise God made to their patriarch. The promise of God wasn't limited to circumcision. "I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you," said the Lord. This covenant ensured that Abraham would be the father of many nations and that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan forever. God also promised that this covenant would remain unbroken, regardless of the circumstances or challenges that might arise in the future. Abraham knew he was dealing with something far greater than himself. It was an eternal covenant that would impact all of humanity. With the covenant firmly established, Abraham built an altar to the Lord, as he had done at earlier moments in his life. This gesture once again represented his unwavering devotion and faith. Abraham knew that circumcision and the new name were just the beginning of a faith journey that would continue to shape his life and the lives of his descendants. The altar he built was a marker of his covenant with God, symbolizing not only gratitude, but the certainty that the promise would be fulfilled, even if God's timing was different from human expectations. Sarah, for her part, shared in the covenant established between Abraham and God. Though she had yet to see the promise of a child fulfilled, she knew that God had included her name in this covenant, making her a princess, the mother of a great nation. Her role in the covenant was just as essential as Abraham's, for it would be through her that the heir of the promise would come. The covenant of blood encompassed the entirety of Abraham and Sarah's lives, and they both knew this covenant would change the course of history. Despite God's promise that Abraham would be the father of a great nation, time continued to pass, and Sarah still had not given birth. As she aged, Sarah's anguish deepened, feeling that the hope of motherhood was slipping away. Feeling responsible for helping Abraham fulfill God's promise, Sarah made a decision that would alter their lives. She offered her servant, Hagar, to Abraham so that he could have a child through her. "Take my maidservant Hagar," Sarah said to Abraham. "Perhaps I can build a family through her." Pressured by the situation, Abraham accepted his wife's suggestion. Hagar conceived, and soon tension began to form within Abraham's household. Realizing she was pregnant, Hagar began to despise Sarah. Sarah, feeling the weight of her decision, became deeply troubled. She turned to Abraham in bitterness. "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant into your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me." Abraham, caught in a moment of tension, responded, "Your servant is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best." So Sarah began to mistreat Hagar, and the situation within the family became unbearable. Hagar, unable to bear Sarah's oppression, fled into the desert. There, alone and desperate, she was found by an angel of the Lord. "Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from, and where are you going?" the angel asked. She replied, "I am running away from my mistress, Sarah." The angel then delivered a divine message. "Return to your mistress and submit to her. I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count." Surprised by God's mercy, Hagar also received a promise. "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." Hagar returned to Abraham and Sarah, and in due time gave birth to a son. Abraham, following the angel's command, named the boy Ishmael, meaning God hears. Although Ishmael was not the son God had promised for the covenant, he carried a special blessing. God promised that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation, a promise that would be fulfilled over generations. However, the arrival of Ishmael brought forth the consequences of Abraham and Sarah's impatience. Their attempt to help God's plan had resulted in tensions that would last for years. As Ishmael grew, Abraham's affection for him deepened, and he began to believe that perhaps God's promise would be fulfilled through him. After all, Ishmael was his firstborn. However, God made it clear to Abraham that Ishmael would not be the heir of the promise. "Your son Ishmael will be blessed," said God, "but my covenant will be established with Isaac, the son Sarah will bear to you." This clarification weighed heavily on Abraham's heart, as he knew the tensions within his family would only grow with time. Despite the circumstances, Abraham continued to care for Ishmael, ensuring that he grew up with everything he needed. Ishmael developed into a strong and determined young man, yet his presence in Abraham's household became increasingly complicated as Sarah watched the son of Hagar grow and thrive. The rivalry between Sarah and Hagar had not disappeared, and the tension between the two mothers began to affect everyone. Although Abraham loved Ishmael, he knew that God's plan was on a different path than the one he had imagined. The story of Ishmael's birth serves as a reminder of the consequences that arise when we try to rush God's plans. Abraham and Sarah's impatience led to a series of family complications that would follow them for many years. Nevertheless, even in the midst of these difficulties, God remained faithful to his promise, and Ishmael received a unique blessing, though he was not the son of the covenant. Abraham learned that God's promise would be fulfilled in its own time, and that he had to trust fully in the divine plan without trying to control it by his own means. With Ishmael growing up, Abraham began to realize that God's promise concerning his descendants wouldn't be fulfilled in a conventional way. The arrival of Isaac, the promised son, was still to come, and this new reality would once again test Abraham's faith. One day, during his daily routine, Abraham had an encounter that would change everything. He was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day when he saw three men approaching. As soon as he saw them, Abraham realized they were no ordinary visitors. In a rush, he ran to meet them, bowing low and saying, "My lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass your servant by." Abraham, ever generous, offered them water, rest, and food. He instructed Sarah to bake bread and one of his servants to prepare a calf for the guests. The three men accepted Abraham's hospitality. As they ate, one of them asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" Abraham replied, "She is in the tent." The visitor, who clearly knew intimate details of Abraham's life, made a surprising statement. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." These words thundered silently in Abraham's heart. Sarah, who was listening from inside the tent, laughed quietly to herself. After all, how could she, old and barren, bear a child? The visitor, who was the Lord himself, knowing Sarah's thoughts, said, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you, and Sarah will have a son." At first, Sarah denied laughing, saying, "I did not laugh." But the Lord replied, "No, you did laugh." This brief exchange revealed Sarah's internal struggle between disbelief and hope. Though the promise seemed impossible by human standards, God's word remained unshakable. Abraham remained silent, knowing that the Lord's promise was greater than any circumstance. After the meal, the men rose to leave for Sodom, but before they departed, the promise was sealed. Sarah would give birth to a son, and he would be named Isaac, meaning laughter. This name would serve as a lasting reminder of the moment when Sarah laughed, and how God turned her disbelief into joy. For Abraham, this moment was yet another confirmation of God's faithfulness. The promise of an heir through Sarah, something he and his wife had waited for so long, was finally within reach. The son of the covenant was on his way. Sarah, on the other hand, continued to wrestle with the magnitude of the promise. The idea of becoming a mother in her old age still seemed absurd, but at the same time, something inside her began to change. The visit from the three angels, and especially the words from the Lord, planted a seed of hope. She knew that if God had spoken, nothing could stop the fulfillment of his words. The laughter that had once been of disbelief was now transforming into a smile of expectation as she prepared for the miracle. For Abraham, the visit from the three angels was not just an encounter with the divine, but a confirmation that the long wait was nearing its end. He had walked with God for many years, faced challenges and made difficult decisions, but now the fulfillment of the promise was about to happen. Abraham's faith, tested and refined over time, became even more solid with the confirmation that the promised son would be born from Sarah. The covenant between God and Abraham would be passed on through Isaac, and the lineage of the promise would continue. The promise of Isaac's birth marked a turning point in the story of Abraham and Sarah. They who had tried by their own means to fulfill the promise through Ishmael now saw that God had a bigger plan. The visit from the angels brought clarity and renewed both of their faith, reminding them that God fulfills his promises in his perfect time. Abraham and Sarah were about to witness the miracle, and Isaac's arrival would bring not only joy, but also the certainty that the divine covenant was alive and active in their lives. After the visit from the three angels, Abraham accompanied the men as they prepared to leave for Sodom. Along the way, the Lord revealed something to Abraham that deeply troubled him. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grievous, said the Lord. The cities, known for their depravity and injustice, were under divine judgment. God was about to destroy these places because of the wickedness that had spread among their inhabitants. This revelation struck a deep chord in Abraham, especially since his nephew Lot lived in Sodom. Known for his compassion and closeness to God, Abraham couldn't ignore the impending fate of these cities. He approached the Lord and boldly began to intercede on behalf of Sodom. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city?" Abraham asked, his voice filled with concern. "Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it?" It was a courageous request, as Abraham was, in a way, questioning God's justice. But his confidence in God's character drove him to continue. The Lord responded with mercy. "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." This answer gave Abraham some relief, but he knew that finding 50 righteous people in such a corrupt place might be difficult. So, humbly, Abraham continued to intercede. "What if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? Once again, God responded patiently, "If I find 45 there, I will not destroy it." This dialogue continued, with Abraham interceding boldly and God showing his mercy. Abraham kept lowering the number, always with respect and fear, until he reached 10. "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there?" God's response was clear. "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." Upon hearing this, Abraham fell silent. He knew that he had done all he could. Though the number of righteous people in the city was uncertain, Abraham trusted that God would be both just and merciful in his judgment. Abraham's intercession demonstrated his deep connection with God, as well as his sense of justice and compassion. As the angels continued on their way to Sodom, Abraham returned to his tent with a heavy heart. He had interceded for the cities, but he knew that divine judgment was imminent. The fate of Sodom and Gomorrah was sealed, but Abraham trusted that God would take care of Lot and his family. Abraham's intercession also revealed his character, a man who, even in the face of a corrupt city, did not wish for its destruction without first giving a chance for repentance and justice. His compassion was a reflection of God's heart. Abraham's decision to intercede for Sodom was not just an act of love for his nephew, but also an acknowledgement of the severity of sin. He knew that Sodom was immersed in wickedness, but even so, his faith in God's justice made him cry out for mercy. This intercession marked an important moment in Abraham's story, showing how his relationship with God went beyond simple obedience. He was truly a friend of God, someone who could speak directly with the Lord and present his concerns without fear. Despite Abraham's intercession, Sodom and Gomorrah were not spared. The sin of the cities was too great, and God sent his angels to rescue Lot and his family, before completely destroying the cities with fire and brimstone. Even so, Abraham's act of intercession reveals the power of prayer and compassion. Though judgment came, God's mercy was shown in the rescue of Lot, a righteous man in the midst of corruption. When Abraham learned of the city's fate, he realized that his intercession had not been in vain, for God had shown grace to his family. Now, with Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed and Lot safe, Abraham would continue his journey of faith, still waiting for the promise of an heir to be fulfilled. The destruction of the cities was a reminder of God's power and justice, but also of the importance of intercession. Abraham knew that, despite difficult circumstances, he could always count on God's faithfulness and justice. Finally, the time of waiting was over. After years of anticipation and doubt, God fulfilled his promise to Abraham and Sarah. When Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, the long-awaited son was born, Isaac. The joy that filled Abraham's household was indescribable. "God has brought me laughter," said Sarah as she held her son in her arms, "and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." Isaac, whose name means laughter, was the fulfillment of the divine promise, a symbol that, even when circumstances seemed impossible, God remained faithful. For Sarah, Isaac's birth was a double miracle, not only because of her advanced age, but also because she had been barren her entire life. Now, in her old age, she finally held the promised child in her arms. The disbelief that led her to laugh when she first heard the angel's promise had now turned into laughter of joy and gratitude. Isaac was more than just a son. He was living proof that God never forgets his promises, even when they seem delayed by human standards. Abraham, on the other hand, saw in Isaac the realization of everything God had promised. He knew that his son would be the heir of the covenant, the channel through which God's blessings would spread to all humanity. Every time Abraham looked at the boy, he remembered the journey he had traveled, from leaving Ur to reaching Canaan, from trials of faith to the promises God made at each stage of his life. Isaac embodied the covenant God had established with him, and Abraham knew that the future was now secure. Isaac's birth brought new energy to Abraham's household. Everyone knew that Isaac was no ordinary baby. He was the child of the promise, the one for whom Abraham and Sarah had waited so long. There was a silent reverence in every action surrounding the boy, for he represented God's faithfulness. The celebrations of his birth were filled with meaning, and even Abraham's servants and herdsmen felt that something extraordinary was happening. Isaac's birth was not just a family event, but a milestone in the history of the covenant between God and Abraham. As Isaac grew, Abraham and Sarah realized that every stage of his life was a living reminder of the divine covenant. His childhood was surrounded by special care, and he was raised with the full awareness that God had a unique purpose for his life. Abraham knew that Isaac would not only inherit his possessions and flocks, but more importantly, he would carry the weight and privilege of the covenant God had made with him. Isaac would be the link between past promises and future fulfillment. However, Isaac's presence also brought to light tensions within Abraham's household. Ishmael, the son Abraham had with Hagar, was also growing, and the tensions between Sarah and Hagar began to intensify once again. Sarah, protective of Isaac, feared that Ishmael, being older, might threaten her son's inheritance. This rivalry between the two mothers became increasingly evident, and Abraham knew that he would soon have to address the situation. God had promised that Isaac would be the heir of the covenant, but Ishmael's presence could not be ignored. Despite the family difficulties, Abraham remained firm in his faith. He knew that God had a plan, and Isaac's birth was the living proof that God's promises would be fulfilled regardless of the circumstances. Abraham, with the wisdom he had gained over the years, trusted that God would guide each step of his family, even amid tensions and uncertainties. Isaac was the promised gift, and Abraham would care for him with all the dedication he could, knowing that Isaac would become the father of a great nation, as God had declared. Now that Isaac had been born, Abraham's future was secure. God's covenant with him was becoming stronger with each passing day, and the promise that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky was in full motion. After Isaac's birth, Abraham enjoyed years of peace and joy with his son. But one day God called him again, this time with a test that would shake his faith to its core. "Abraham," said the Lord, "take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. These words pierced Abraham's heart like a knife. The son of the promise, the heir of the covenant, was now to be sacrificed. Even without understanding, Abraham did not hesitate. His unwavering obedience to God was greater than any doubt or pain he felt. The next morning, Abraham rose early, prepared his donkey, and took 2 of his servants and Isaac to accompany him. For 3 days, they traveled to the place God had designated. Abraham, silent, carried the weight of God's command in his heart. How could he explain to Isaac what was about to happen? With each step, Abraham's faith was tested. On the 3rd day, he lifted his eyes and saw the mountain in the distance. "Stay here with the donkey," Abraham said to his servants. "The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Isaac, carrying the wood for the sacrifice, began to sense something was amiss. "Father," he said, "here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's heart tightened, but his response was one of extraordinary faith. "God himself will provide the lamb, my son." These words, filled with confidence, revealed the depth of Abraham's faith. Even in the face of such an extreme situation, he believed that God had a greater plan, something he couldn't yet understand, but that would be revealed in due time. When they reached the place God had indicated, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood. Then, with a heavy heart, he bound Isaac and laid him on the altar. The silence between them was thick, and every movement Abraham made was a demonstration of his total obedience. As he raised the knife to sacrifice his son, an angel of the Lord called out from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" Immediately, Abraham stopped and replied, "Here I am." "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the angel said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." With his heart still racing, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. This was the sacrifice God had provided. In gratitude and relief, Abraham released Isaac and offered the ram in his place. The place was called Jehovah-Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. For indeed, God had provided the lamb for the sacrifice. Abraham knew that the test had been great, but his faith had remained unshakable. He not only obeyed but trusted that God was faithful to fulfill his promises, even when everything seemed incomprehensible. After the sacrifice, the angel of the Lord spoke to Abraham again, reaffirming the covenant. "I swear by myself," declares the Lord, "that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies." These words brought an even stronger confirmation of the divine promise. Abraham now knew that his descendants would indeed be blessed, and that Isaac was the vital link for the future of the covenant. The walk back with Isaac was silent but full of meaning. Both had gone through the ultimate test of faith, and God had once again proven his faithfulness. Isaac, though still young, understood the depth of his father's faith and the seriousness of the covenant with God. For Abraham, this episode reinforced the truth that God always provides, even in the most uncertain and painful moments. The sacrifice of Isaac, though never completed, became a symbol of absolute obedience and total trust in God. Now that the test had been overcome, Abraham was ready to continue his journey, knowing that he had fulfilled the most difficult of God's commands. God's promise was more alive than ever, and Abraham was certain that his descendants would be blessed forever. The near sacrifice of Isaac would forever mark Abraham's story of faith, showing future generations that true faith is demonstrated not only in times of victory, but also in the hardest trials when all that remains is to trust completely in God. Abraham lived to be 175 years old, a long and full life. When his time came to leave this world, he did so in peace, surrounded by his children and descendants. Abraham, the patriarch of faith, was buried alongside Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, the same place he had purchased years earlier to bury his beloved wife. His death marked the end of an era, but not the end of his influence. Though his earthly journey had ended, the impact of his life, his faith, and his covenant with God would endure for generations as one of the greatest spiritual legacies of humanity. After his death, Abraham was honored as the father of a great nation, just as God had promised. Through Isaac, the lineage of the promise would continue, and Abraham would be known as the father of many nations. His life was marked by moments of extreme obedience and unwavering trust in divine promises. even when everything seemed impossible. Abraham became an example of faith, not only for his biological descendants, but for all who would follow his path of obedience and trust in God. The covenant God made with Abraham didn't end with his death. On the contrary, it extended to his descendants, beginning with Isaac and continuing through Jacob and the generations to come. This covenant guaranteed that Abraham's descendants would inherit the land of Canaan, and that through them, all nations of the earth would be blessed. Abraham understood throughout his life that his faith was not only for himself, but for the generations that would follow him. He was the pioneer of a covenant that transcended time and shaped the course of history. Even after his death, Abraham's legacy remained alive. He was not only the patriarch of a nation, he became the patriarch of faith. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all revere him as an example of faith and obedience to God. His name became synonymous with trusting in divine promises, and his story is told and retold as a testament that God fulfills his promises, regardless of the circumstances. Abraham lived by obedience, walked by faith, and left a spiritual legacy that would never fade. Abraham's legacy expanded not only through his direct lineage, but also through his spiritual influence. He set a standard of covenant with God that would be followed by many. Abraham's story is a clear example that true faith doesn't depend on knowing all the details, but on fully trusting God, even when the promises seem distant. Abraham not only believed in God's promises, he lived according to them, and his obedience paved the way for their fulfillment. Abraham's impact was profound because his life was built on trusting God. He understood that his faith had to be passed down, not only as a physical inheritance, but as a spiritual legacy. Every decision Abraham made throughout his life was guided by the certainty that God was faithful. He demonstrated that true faith often requires sacrifice, but that sacrifice always results in blessing. Abraham was the first to walk this path, opening the way for many others to follow in his footsteps. Now that Abraham had rested in peace, his descendants took up the place God had promised. Isaac, the heir of the covenant, would be the next to carry the torch, keeping the flame of the divine promise alive. But Abraham's legacy wasn't limited to his immediate descendants. He impacted entire generations, becoming one of the most respected and revered patriarchs in the spiritual history of humanity. His life proved that with faith and obedience, anyone can be part of God's grand plan. Abraham left an example that true faith creates deep roots, transcending time and space. His journey wasn't just about reaching a promised land, but about establishing a pattern of relationship with God that would touch the world. His legacy as the father of nations and the patriarch of faith is an eternal testimony that God honors those who follow him faithfully. Even after his death, Abraham continues to inspire, showing that faith is the foundation of any great spiritual legacy. Now that you've heard Abraham's incredible journey, what does this story awaken in you? Abraham's unshakable faith, even in the midst of uncertainties, teaches us that when we trust God, we can overcome any challenge. Are we willing to follow this example, to listen to God's call even when we don't know where he will lead us? Abraham's life challenges us to have bold faith, faith that believes in the impossible. I invite you to reflect. What promises has God made in your life? Are you ready to follow him, even when the path seems uncertain? Don't let fear or doubt keep you from living out what God has planned for you. Abraham showed us that it's in obedience that promises are fulfilled. Share in the comments what impacted you most about this story. What part of Abraham's journey inspired you? Let's talk about it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep learning more about these powerful lessons from the Bible. And to close, let's pray together, asking God to strengthen our faith and guide us on our own journey, just as he did with Abraham. Lord God Almighty, we come before you with humble and grateful hearts. Like Abraham, we want to walk in faith, trusting in every promise you have for our lives, even when the path seems uncertain. We know that you are faithful and that your promises never fail. Father, help us to have unshakable faith like Abraham, who followed you without hesitation, believing in the impossible. Strengthen our trust in you so that we can face life's challenges with courage, knowing that you are in control. May we hear your voice and obey, even when we don't understand your plan. May you guide us on our journey, just as you guided Abraham, and help us to be patient as we wait for the fulfillment of your promises. May we be an example of faith to those around us, and may our lives be a living testimony of your grace and faithfulness. We ask you, Father, to pour out your wisdom upon us, so that we may discern your will and follow your path. Renew our strength and fill us with hope, knowing that you are the God who fulfills promises. May Abraham's legacy inspire us to live a life of complete trust in you. In Jesus' name we ask and thank you. Amen.